Okay, so question one, suppose sellers rather than buyers were required to pay this tax in the same amount per unit as shown on the graph. Relative to the tax on buyers, the tax on sellers would result in. So a few things that we know, no matter who we tax, the buyer or the seller, the tax ends up being the same. The outcome of the tax is exactly the same. So right up there at 24 is the price buyers pay. Right here at 16 is the price sellers receive. And we know that the difference between 16 and 18 is the size of the tax. So in this market, there is a tax of $24 minus 16, which equals 8. The tax burden on the buyers is going to be this distance, the distance between 24 and 18. So burden or incidence on the buyer is equal to 24 minus 18, which is equal to 6. The incidence on the seller is going to be equal to the difference between 18 and 16, so the original price in the market minus the price they now get, so it's 18 minus 16, which equals to 2. Okay. Now, the very first thing I said at the beginning of this question was that regardless of who we levy the tax on, whether it's the buyer or the seller, we're going to get exactly the same outcome for all of these things. The burden is going to remain the same, the tax size is going to remain the same, the price buyers pay is going to remain the same, the price sellers receive is going to remain the same. Nothing is going to change. So no matter who we levy this tax on, whether it's the sellers or the buyers, all of our outcomes are exactly the same. Okay, so we know that in this case, buyers will bear the same share of the tax burden. Sellers will also bear the same share of the tax burden. And there will be the same amount of government revenue for the tax because the size of the tax hasn't changed, the quantity hasn't changed, which leads us to our answer that D, all of the above are correct. So then D is going to be our correct answer. Two, total surplus in a market will increase when the government. So when we're looking at our basic market, we put price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, demand goes down, supply goes up. Right? The total surplus in the market is just going to be all of this area initially. Right? So then that's going to be total surplus. It will increase when the government. Well, if they impose a tax on the market, we can make a market really quickly. Another one where previously you have that whole triangle, that whole red triangle. If they impose a tax, well, now they're losing all of this area, that deadweight loss of the tax. So that's surplus that's no longer being given. So if they were to impose a tax, then you would see total surplus would actually go down. So that's not correct. If they impose a binding price floor on that market, well, if we go ahead and we look at this and we say, okay, here's a binding price floor. Remember, price floors bind when they are above equilibrium. Well, again, we can only ever get surplus from products that are actually consumed. So that's going to give us this new Q down here, which means we're also losing a bunch of surplus, just like we were before. We're losing this little triangle to the right of our new consumption point, because you can only get surplus from units that are either bought or sold, or for units that are bought and sold. So then we know that imposing a binding price floor is also not going to create an increase in surplus. However, well, that leaves us with two possibilities. Either C, we remove a ceiling, or D, none of the above is correct. Well, if we look at removing a ceiling, if the ceiling binds initially, it's below equilibrium. And we would be losing all of this area over here. Well, when we remove the ceiling, we actually move ourselves back to equilibrium, to our P star, Q star, and we gain all of that area back to get us back to this original graph that we had where surplus is maximized. So the only thing here that is actually going to increase the total surplus in the market is removing a binding price ceiling from that market. So we can go ahead and say, great, C is the answer. Question 3. In the market for widgets, the supply curve is the typical upward sloping straight line, and the demand curve is the typical downward sloping straight line. The equilibrium quantity in the market for widgets is 200 per month when there is no tax. Then a tax of $5 per widget is imposed. As a result, the government is able to raise $800 per month in tax revenue. We can conclude that the equilibrium quantity of widgets has fallen by. Well, what happens when we impose a tax? So we can redraw this little tax graph that we had. Put a tax in there. This one is the price sellers receive. This is the price buyers pay. This was, what in the world? Sorry about that. This was the initial equilibrium price, P star. Our initial equilibrium quantity was Q star, and our new quantity after the tax is right here, quantity after tax. All right, so we know that the tax is $5. So we know that the distance between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive is $5. The government is able to raise $800 per month in tax revenue. Well, we know that tax revenue is equal to the size of the tax times the quantity sold, the quantity after tax. So we actually have a lot of information here. We have this tax revenue of 800. So we can go ahead and put that $800 in there. We know that the size of tax is 5. We don't know what the quantity after tax is. Well, we want to know, we can conclude that the equilibrium quantity has fallen by what? Well, we're given our equilibrium quantity of 200. We have this quantity after tax that we're asked to solve for. So setting up that total revenue function, we divide both sides by 5. So now we have that 160 equals the quantity after the tax. Well, we're asked to find how much has it fallen by. Before we had a quantity of 200, so we need to take our Q star minus our quantity after the tax, and that's going to give us how much the quantity has fallen by, the change in quantity. Okay, well, 200 minus the 160 we found equals 40. So quantity has fallen by 40, our answer must be A. Question 4. The price received by sellers in a market will increase if the government decreases A. Remember, the price received by sellers is just the difference between is either the equilibrium price or the price buyers pay minus the tax. So sellers receive the equilibrium price or they receive the price buyers pay minus the tax equals the price sellers receive. So the price sellers receive in a market will increase if the government decreases A. Well, if we're subtracting a tax, if we're subtracting this tax out and we make that tax smaller, what happens to the right-hand side of this equation, the price sellers receive? Well, the price sellers receive must go up if a tax decreases, right? 5 minus 3 is equal to 2. Whereas if we decrease that tax to 1, 5 minus 1 is equal to 4, the price sellers receive has gone up in this case. Right? So that means price sellers receive has increased. Well, let's go ahead and look through these examples and see if that's a possible solution. Binding price floor in that market. Well, when we put a binding price floor, what does that do? Floors only bind when they're above us, which means if we put that price floor in here, well, what's happened to the price that sellers receive? It's moved up from equilibrium and it's now higher than it was before. So a binding price floor in that market, well, it's asking what? If the government decreases a binding price floor, well, if they decrease that binding price floor, they're moving it down. So then that can't possibly be the right answer. So we can go ahead and mark that off. If you put a if you decrease a binding price ceiling, well, a binding price ceiling is where? A ceiling only binds when it's below equilibrium. So when I put a price ceiling in the market, I lower the price sellers receive. If I decrease the price ceiling, that actually means there's less of a price ceiling, which moves the price ceiling up, which is actually going to raise the price sellers receive. I realize the wording here is a little rough. I will try to avoid wording like that in the future. When you decrease a price ceiling, you're actually raising the price in that market because you're saying that the ceiling, you're not actually moving the ceiling lower. Okay, so then if you tax a good, obviously the price goes down, and then none of the above is not correct. Question 5. Oops, I should circle that guy in green because that's the right answer. Check. A paper plant produces water pollution during the production process. If the government forces the plant to internalize the negative activity, then remember, when you internalize a negative externality, what you're saying is you guys are going to have to pay for this externality. So if the government forces the plant to internalize the negative externality, then well, they're making the plant do it. So that's going to always shift the supply curve. Price quantity. The supply curve is equal to the private cost curve. The demand curve is equal to the private benefit. When we have externalities, we either have these additional social costs or these additional social benefits. In this case, this is a social cost because it's a negative externality, and they're making the plant internalize it. So what happens to the supply curve is the supply curve shifts to the left because it's an additional social cost. So it's an additional cost. And remember, when costs increase for a supplier, they're less willing to supply at any given price. So our new supply curve is shifted to the left. So this is after internalization. Okay. So then it forces the supply curve to shift to the left. Question 6. If the equilibrium price rises from 60 to 120, what is the additional producer surplus to initial producers in the market? So here we have a few things. Our initial producer surplus is this area, the area below the price and above supply. So that's our initial producer surplus. And that's equal to, it's a triangle, so it's 1/2 base times the height. The base of that triangle runs from 0 to 80, and the height of that triangle is from 0 to 60. So it's just equal to 1/2 60 times 80. So that's equal to 240. Okay. Once the price rises to here, to 120, we see that the area gained, the total area gained, is all of this area that I'm highlighting, right? That's the total area gained. But specifically, this question asks, if the equilibrium price rises from 60 to 120, what is the additional surplus to initial producers in this market? Well, who are the initial producers? The initial producers are all of these 80 people that were producing this 80 quantity that was in the market before. So these are our initial producers. So then we need to find the additional surplus that they gain. And they gain just this blue area right here. And the area of that rectangle is just base times height. So it's 120 minus 60 times 80 minus 0, 60 times 80 is equal to 480. Oops, I think I missed zeros on both of these. Sorry about that. Let me just put those zeros in there real quick. So then the additional, that blue area is just this 4,800. So that's going to be our answer. Moving on to question 7, suppose a price ceiling of $5 is imposed on this market. So let's go ahead and put that price ceiling in there. The first thing that we should do, even before we look at the answers provided, is see if this is going to bind or not. Whenever a price ceiling is below equilibrium, it's binding. So we know that it's binding. Okay. And we can get a few things from this, right? The quantity supplied is 20. The quantity demanded is 60. When a price ceiling binds, it causes a shortage, which is equal to the quantity demanded minus the quantity supplied. So we get our shortage here is 60 minus 20. We have a shortage of 40. Okay. Great. So as a result, the quantity of the good supplied decreases by 20 units. Well, we didn't find that yet, so then let's see what our previous supply was at equilibrium. At equilibrium, we had a Q star of 40. Well, that if there were 40 being consumed and 40 being supplied at equilibrium, and now there are only 20 supplied, we know that Q star minus QS is the decrease, is the change in quantity supplied. So we just take that 40 minus 20. We know that it fell by 20 units. Right? The demand curve shifts to the left. Nope, there's no shifting of the demand curve. Buyer's total expenditure on the good decreases by 80. Well, what is total expenditure? The total expenditure is how much money they spent on the good before. Well, how much money were they actually spending on this good before? It's this, their total expenditure was actually this area. So it would have been which is equal to total revenue, which is equal to price times quantity. So it would have been 7 times 40. 280. And then we would have to find the new total expenditure. Well, how much can they actually spend now that we've moved the quantity supplied down to 20? Well, now they're paying a price of 5 because that's where our price ceiling is. So now this is their new total expenditure. And that's 5 times 20, which equals 100. 280 minus 100 is equal to 180. So we know that C is also not correct. The price of the good continues to serve as the rationing mechanism. No, remember, there has to be some sort of other rationing mechanism whenever there is a shortage or a surplus in a market. Price is what economists like to use as the rationing mechanism, but when that fails, other rationing mechanisms like bribery or theft or whatever are used. Ty lives in an apartment building and gets a benefit from playing his stereo. Olivia, who lives next door to Ty and often loses sleep due to loud music coming from Ty's stereo, bears a cost from the noise. Olivia is threatening to call the police to force Ty to turn down his stereo. Under which of the following conditions would Ty be able to offer Olivia some amount of money to keep her from calling the police and to allow him to continue to play his stereo? So this is a Coase theorem question. Remember, as long as transaction costs are not too high, two parties can come together and reach an acceptable agreement among themselves as long as the marginal benefit is higher than the marginal cost. So if the cost of the noise to Olivia exceeds the benefit of the music to Ty, well then Ty is never going to be willing to pay Olivia enough to continue listening to his music. So that's out. If the benefit of the music to Ty exceeds the cost of the noise to Olivia, well then Ty is going to be willing to pay up to his benefit of the music in order to make Olivia happy. The Coase theorem does not guarantee that they will always be able to come to an agreement, because his benefits of listening to the music must be greater than her costs. The cost of the noise to Olivia must exceed the benefit of the music to Ty. Well, no, that's also not the case, because the cost of the noise to Olivia, if they ever exceed that benefit of the music to Ty, then they'll never reach an agreement. All right. For each of three potential buyers of questions 9 and 10. For each of three potential buyers of oranges, the table displays the willingness to pay for the first three oranges of the day. Assume Allison, Bob, and Charisse are the only three buyers of oranges. So if they're the only three buyers of oranges, then we don't have to worry about anything else. They determine the market. They determine how much to buy based off of the market price. So if the market price of an orange is 65 cents, then consumer surplus is going to be however many oranges are bought minus their value minus the price that they have to pay. So they have to pay 65 cents for each orange. Well, first, how many is Charisse going to consume? She's only going to consume one. Bob is going to consume two, and Allison is going to consume all three of hers. For the first one that Allison consumes, we can do the $2 minus the 65 cents plus the 150 minus the 65 cents she has to pay plus the 0.75 minus the 65 cents she has to pay. And then we can move on to Bob and say, well, his first one is worth 150 to him, but he pays that 65 cents. His second one is worth $1, but he pays that 65 cents. And his third one is worth 60 cents, so he doesn't consume it because you're never willing to pay more for a good than you value it. And Charisse values her first orange at 75 cents, which is higher than 65, so she goes ahead and buys it. So we've got 10 cents of benefit to her. To Bob, we have 85 cents for the first one. For the second one, we have 35 cents. So that gives us $1.20. And for Allison, her first orange is $1.35 worth of benefit. Plus her second orange's benefit of 85 cents. Plus her third benefit of 10 cents. So then that gives her a total of $2.30. $2.30. Yep. So then we take the $2.30. So we do the $2.30 that she receives plus the $1.20 that Bob receives plus the 10 cents that Charisse receives, and we get to $3.60. So your answer here is going to be C. The market quantity of orange. Question 10. The market quantity of oranges demanded per day is exactly 7 if the price of an orange satisfies what? Well, so we need to get to 7 oranges. Remember, the people who value the oranges most are going to be the people that consume them. So $2 is the first orange consumed. We have 1, and then we have 2, and then we have 3 oranges. Because next, those people who value them at $1.50 are going to consume them, and then next at $1, and then next at 75 cents and 75 cents. Now we have 6 oranges. So we need to get to our 7th orange. In order to consume our 7th orange, we need to see this value of 60 cents be realized. So then the price needs to be below 60 cents in order for Bob to consume that 7th orange in this market. But the price cannot go below 25 cents. Otherwise, Charisse is going to consume another orange and we're going to go above 7. So the price needs to be between 25 cents and 60 cents. So then we just go ahead and we look for that. 60 and 75, nope. 60 and $2, no. 25 and 75, no. That leaves us with D. Question 11. Suppose a tax of $5 per unit is imposed on this market. What will be the new equilibrium quantity in this market? Well, if the tax in this figure was actually imposed, that it's showing here, what would be the size of that tax? The size of that tax would actually be 9, because remember, tax size is equal to the price buyers pay minus the price sellers receive. Well, the price buyers pay there would be 14 minus 5. That would give us 9. We're asked in this question specifically, we are told that the tax is $5 per unit. Well, if the tax is $5 per unit, then we know that it's going to fall somewhere in between this $9 in equilibrium, this $9 tax in equilibrium, which means the quantity is going to be somewhere in this area for the $5 tax between 25 and 50. So the new equilibrium quantity in this market, we know it's not going to be less than 25 units, because even if we tax it $9, we get at least 25 units. 25 units would be for the tax of $9. It's not going to be any greater than equilibrium, so then that means that it must be between 25 and 50 units. Question 12. Suppose D1 represents the demand curve for gasoline in the short run and the long run. So we know that this D1 is going to be both our short run and long run demand curve. S1 represents the supply curve for gasoline in the short run, and S2 represents the supply curve for gasoline in the long run. So this is the short run, and this is the long run. After the imposition of the $2 tax, the price paid by buyers will be higher in the short run than in the long run, or is it going to be higher in the long run than the short run? Or is it going to be equivalent? Well, what do we know here? We know that the short run supply curve is more inelastic than the long run supply curve, which is more elastic. Whichever curve is more inelastic bears more of the tax burden. So then suppliers in the short run are going to bear more of the tax burden than they will in the long run, which means that buyers in the short run will bear less of the burden than they will in the long run. So that leads us to A, the price buyers pay will be higher in the long run than it will in the short run, because the buyer's curve doesn't change. It's the same for both the short and long run, but the suppliers become more elastic on the long run, which shifts more of the tax burden to the buyers in the long run. Question 13, suppose D1 represents demand curve for gasoline in both the short run and the long run. S1 represents the supply curve in the short run, and S2 represents the supply curve for gasoline in the long run. After the $2 tax is imposed, buyers bear a higher burden of tax in the short run than in the long run. Well, what did we just say in the above? No, the price buyers pay is higher in the long run than in the short run because they bear more of the burden in the long run. Sellers bear a higher burden of the tax in the short run than in the long run. Perfect. We know that the sellers do in fact bear a higher burden of the tax in the short run than in the long run because their curve becomes more elastic in the long run.